Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the last session of today's first day of the 14th FIW Conference in International Economics on a, of course, very special day we're gonna have had already. My name is Harald Oberhofer. I'm the project lead of the FIW-Project, and I will host the session. The session will contain two parts. First, we're going to have a keynote lecture, which will be followed by a policy panel discussion. I will introduce now our keynote, and after the keynote, we're going to directly start with the panel, and I will then introduce our panelists for the panel discussion after the keynote lecture concluded. Just a few words on the housekeeping rules. You can participate in this discussion by using the Q&A section here in Zoom. So just post your questions or comments, and I will collect them, and we're gonna introduce those to the panel after the keynote lecture. That would be the plan. Now with this, I would like to move on with introducing our today's keynote lecture. It's my great honor to introduce Natalie Chen for today's keynote lecture. Natalie is professor of economics at University of Warwick. She holds a PhD in economics from University Libre de Brussels, Belgium. After completing PhD, she spent some time at the London Business School. She's also a CAPR research fellow. Her research interests are not a big surprise for this conference in applied international economics, covering both international trade and international macro topics, as well as European integration. Natalie has published quite frequently in all of our major relevant top field journals in international economics, including the Journal of International Economics, Economic Journal, Journal of the European Economic Association, Journal of Development Economics, to just mention a few of them. Today, Natalie is going to give a talk about quality and prices. I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Natalie. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so well, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to present here today. So it's a shame that the conference had to be moved online, but I hope that I will be able to visit Vienna in person in the near future. So what I'm going to do today in this presentation is to talk a bit about the recent literature on quality and trade, with a special focus on quality and trade prices. And I will also talk about some of my recent research in this field. So I will talk for a bit less than 45 minutes so that I can take questions if there are any questions on what I'm going to present. So some of you probably know that there is a recent literature that is concerned with how quality impacts trade flows, but also trade prices. So some of the earlier contributions include Hummels and Klenow and Schott, who, for instance, show that richer countries tend to export more expensive goods, which is consistent with the idea that richer countries produce and therefore export higher quality goods. On the demand side, for instance, Halak shows that richer countries tend to import more from countries that export more expensive goods, which tends to suggest that richer countries have a stronger preference for higher quality goods. On the demand and supply sides, Finster and Romalis provide a similar result in the sense that richer countries tend to both export and import higher quality goods. Then more recently, a number of papers have looked at how quality relates to the performance of exporting firms using firm level data. And some of those papers focus on trade flows, while others also look at trade prices. For instance, the paper by Bastos and Silva, Crozet and co-authors, or also Manova and Zhang. So there's an interest both in trade flows, but also in trade prices. The challenge, however, in that literature for empirical analysis is how to measure quality in the data. And a common approach that has been used is to use trade unit values or trade prices as a proxy for quality, under the assumption that more expensive goods tend to have a higher quality. However, this approach is problematic if the objective is to explain how quality affects trade prices, because you cannot explain trade prices by themselves. So some papers have come up with some new approaches in order to measure quality. For instance, you have the paper by Candelwal or Pivetou and Smagu, where what they do is to estimate quality based on different models. And there are some other papers that instead observe an observable measure of quality. So for instance, the paper by Crozet and co-authors, what they do is to use experts rating for champagne exports. Atkin and co-authors, they use artisan assessments for Egyptian rugs, while Medina, what she does is to look at the composition of primary materials that are used in order to produce apparel products. So when the objective is to study trade prices, another challenge is also to distinguish between changes in markups and changes in marginal costs. So this distinction is quite important because changes in markups capture the extent of price discrimination by firms, and therefore they give an indication of the pricing strategies of trading firms. However, in the data, it's quite easy to observe data on trade unit values or trade prices, but it is quite difficult to identify whether a change in price is due to a change in markups or to a change in marginal costs. There are quite a few papers, however, that are able to study the variation in markups using firm-level data. So for instance, the paper by De Locker and co-authors, what they show is that markups in India respond to trade liberalization. Berman and co-authors, they show that markups respond to exchange rate fluctuations, while Simonovska shows that markups vary with per capita income. So together with my co-author, Luciana Juvenal, who's actually attending also today, we have collected a new data set on Argentinian firm-level exports of highly disaggregated wine products. And we have combined this data with experts' wine ratings as a measure of quality. So this new data set offers two main advantages. The first is that the data are very highly disaggregated, as I will show you later, which means that given the level of disaggregation of the data, by controlling for appropriate fixed effects in the regressions, we can identify the variation in markups of those Argentinian wine exporters. And the second main advantage is that we have an observable measure of quality that we can use to explain prices, but also markups. So we have used this data set in several projects in order to understand how markups vary in response to different types of shocks and to look at the heterogeneity across different levels of quality. So for instance, in our paper, in our 2016 paper, what we do is, or what we show is that in response to a real depreciation of domestic currency, exporters tend to increase their markups, especially for higher quality exports. So this means that the pass-through of exchange rate changes actually decreases with quality. And conversely, we find that higher quality exports respond less to changes in exchange rates. In the 2018 paper, we use again the same data set, and we show that the negative income shock during the financial crisis reduced to a larger extent the export values, volumes, prices, and markups of higher quality exports. So there was a flight from quality during the financial crisis. And finally, in a more recent paper, the 2022 paper, what we do is to show that exporters price discriminate across markets, and therefore they vary their markups depending on trade costs, where we look at different types of trade costs such as bilateral distance and tariffs. And we find that the extent of price discrimination is actually stronger for lower quality exports. So in order to illustrate what we can do with this new data set that we have collected, which allows us to identify the variation in markups and to observe an observable measure of quality, what I'm going to do now is to discuss a bit more what we do in the latest paper that we have, the 2022 paper. So in that paper, the motivation for that paper is based on a robust finding in the empirical trade literature, which shows that exporters tend to set higher prices when they export to more distant countries. So we tend to observe that there's a positive correlation between export prices and bilateral distance. So this positive effect of distance on export prices is usually explained by differences in the quality of exported goods. So if we have a larger share of higher quality and therefore more expensive goods that is exported to more distant countries, then we will tend to observe a positive correlation between export prices and distance. So this effect could arise for two main reasons. The first could be a composition effect that could be due, for instance, to the presence of per unit trade costs, as suggested by Chen and Allen. Or it could also be due to a selection effect in the sense that firms simply choose to export higher quality goods to more distant markets only. So in our paper, we propose a different mechanism that we can identify with our data set of Argentinian wines. And what we argue is that conditional on quality, so once we control for the effect of quality, exporters price discriminate across destinations, and they set higher markups and therefore higher prices when they export to more distant countries. So using this data set of Argentinian wine exports combined with quality ratings, we do several things. First, what we do is that we run regressions where, by controlling for appropriate fixed effects, we can decompose the distance elasticity of export unit values into markups and quality. And this allows us to show that conditional on quality, so once we eliminate the effect of quality, markups increase with bilateral distance. So firms tend to price discriminate based on bilateral distance. Second, given that we have an observable measure of quality, what we do is to look at how quality shapes this relationship between markups and distance. And what we find is that the distance elasticity of markups is actually smaller for higher quality exports. So this means that exporters price discriminate across destinations depending on bilateral distance, but they price discriminate less for higher quality exports. There is also some evidence in the literature that exporters tend to set lower prices in countries with higher tariffs. So what we do is also to extend our analysis to tariffs. And what we show is that once we control for the effect of quality, exporters lower their markups in countries with higher tariffs. But again, the effect is smaller for higher quality exports. So there is less price discrimination for higher quality exports. So basically, from an empirical point of view, what we show is that exporters set higher markups in more distant countries, lower markups in countries with higher tariffs, but in both cases, the effects are smaller for higher quality exports. Then what we do is that from a theoretical point of view, we ask which type of demand functions could explain our results that we find in the data. So to answer this question, we rely on the general framework of Mrazova and Neary, which allows us to relax the assumption of CES preferences, because CES preferences imply constant markups. So what we do is to extend the model by assuming that trade costs have both a per unit and an ad valorem component. So the ad valorem component of trade costs is the standard iceberg trade cost, which is defined as a percentage of the export price per unit traded. So this would be, for instance, 10% per bottle of wine exported, which means that the trade cost is going to be larger for more expensive goods. It's going to vary with the export price that is traded, of the good that is traded. Instead, the per unit cost is a constant cost per unit traded. So this could be, for instance, £10 per bottle of wine, and it's going to be the same cost whether the wine is expensive or cheap. So it's not going to vary depending on the export price of the unit that is being traded. So what we do is to extend this framework by assuming that we have two different types of trade costs. And what the model shows is that as long as the demand function is more convex than log concave, but less than super convex, so less convex than CES, we can get the prediction that markups increase with per unit trade cost, where per unit trade cost can be assumed to increase with distance. So this means that we get the prediction that markups will increase with bilateral distance. And we can get the prediction that markups will decrease with ad valorem trade costs, which can be approximated by tariffs, so on a percentage basis. The reason why we get this result is because once we introduce per unit trade cost in the model, this creates a wedge between the elasticities of demand to the FOB and CIF prices, or to the export and import prices. And what happens is that once we introduce the per unit trade cost, the elasticity of demand to the FOB price depends on both per unit and ad valorem trade costs. So given that the elasticity of demand is going to vary with the two types of trade costs, this is going to lead to a variation in markups, and markups will respond to changes in per unit and ad valorem trade costs. So now let me go to the data. So I'm going to talk a bit about this data set that we have collected. So as I said before, the customs data that we have consists of Argentinian firm level wine exports. So we observe the name of the exporting firm. However, in our analysis, we only focus on wine producers. So we exclude wholesalers and retailers. And actually, in the case of Argentina, most wine is directly exported by the wine producers. So once we exclude the wholesalers and retailers, we only exclude a very small share of the sample. So by focusing on wine producers only, this means that each wine in our sample is going to be exported by one firm only, who's the producer of the wine. So the wine is going to be producer specific or firm specific. Then we observe the destination country for exports. We have the date of shipment. So we have transaction level data between 2002 and 2009, but we aggregate the data at annual frequency. And then crucially for our purposes, for each wine exported, we observe a number of characteristics. So we observe the name of the wine, the type, so whether it is red, white, or rosé. We observe the grape, like Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, etc. And we also have the vintage year, which means that basically we have the same characteristics as the ones that you would observe on a bottle of wine that you can buy in any shop. So the way that we link the wines to the wine producers is through the fact that each wine name is specific to the producer. Okay, so we can easily identify who is the producer of each wine. So we observe the FOB value of exports in US dollars. We observe the volume in liters. And using this information, we can calculate the unit values by dividing the value by the volume at the firm wine destination year level. And what we argue is that our unit values can plausibly be interpreted as prices given the level of disaggregation of the data. For the quality ratings, so what we do is to collect quality ratings from the wine spectator. So the wine spectator, what they do is to taste different wines and to give them a certain quality rating. The quality ratings are given for each wine depending on their name, their grape, their type, and their vintage year, which are the same characteristics as the ones that we observe in the customs dataset. So the quality ratings, they vary between 50 and 100, where a larger value indicates a higher quality. And all those quality ratings can be classified into 6 different bins. So this is how the wine spectator classifies all those different quality ratings. So for instance, a great wine, so the top quality wine would have a rating between 95 and 100. Not recommended wine, which would be a low quality wine, would have a rating between 50 and 74. So we collected those quality ratings, and then we merged them with the custom data set by wine, where each wine is defined according to its name, grape type, and vintage year, which means that for each specific wine, we have a different quality level. So once we match the sample, we observe 237 exporters, a bit less than 9,000 wines, where quality varies between 55 and 97. We have 92 destination countries over the period, and our sample represents about 48% of total exports over the period. So just to give you more information on how disaggregated the data are, so here I'm just reporting a few examples of wines that we can observe in our data set. So the producer and the wine names are confidential, so they're replaced by letters instead. So first look at wines 1, 2, and 3. So they are all produced by a producer with a name A, and they all have a wine name that is the same as the producer name. So here it's very easy to identify that those wines are produced by the producer because they have the same name. Those wines, they have a type where they are red. Here you have the grape, and then you have the vintage year. So first you can see that wines 1 and 2, they're both produced by the same winemaker. They have the same name. They are both red. They have the same grape, but they have a different vintage year. So the first one is produced in 2002. The other one is produced in 2004. Now, if you look at the wine spectator quality rating, the two wines also have a different quality. If you look instead at wine 1 and wine 3, they also produced by the same producer. They have the same name. They're both red wines. They have the same vintage year, 2002, but they have a different grape. But here too, they also have a different quality. So the quality ratings that we have, they really match each unit of observation in our sample. And different wines may have similar characteristics in terms of they share the same name, they have the same vintage year or the similar grape, but they're all going to have their own quality rating. For the wines 4, 5, and 6, this is similar, except here that the wine name is not the same as the wine producer, but anyway, the wines with a name C are all produced by the producer B. So you can still easily merge or identify who is the producer of each wine. Now, in terms of data, the composition of our sample, here are some descriptive statistics by quality bin of the wine spectator. So great wines, the top quality wines, not recommended are the lower quality wines. So in our sample, the largest share of our sample is represented by very good and good wines, which are kind of medium quality wines. They represent the largest share of the sample in terms of number of observations, number of firms, number of wines, and also export share in our sample. The top quality wines, so the great wines, or the low quality wines that are not recommended, instead they have a much lower coverage. What you can also observe is that if you look at the unit values, so this would be like the price per liter of wine exported, you can also observe that higher quality wines tend to be more expensive than lower quality wines. Finally, the higher quality wines, the great wines, here this is the number of destination countries where they are exported. So you can see that top quality wines tend to be exported to a smaller number of countries than the other categories of wines. Those countries tend also to be more distant from Argentina, and they also tend to be richer. So the top quality wines are exported further away and also to richer countries. Okay, so now let me go to the empirical analysis. So what we want to do here is to see how markups vary across destinations depending on bilateral distance, tariffs, and the quality of exports. So what we do is to estimate the unit value of each wine K exported by firm I to country J in year T on the bilateral distance between Argentina and country J. We also have the 6-digit level tariff imposed by country J on Argentinian wine exports. And then we interact distance and tariffs with the quality ratings of the wine spectator, which are defined for each wine K. So this allows us to see if there is some heterogeneity in the effects of distance and tariffs on markups and on prices. We also include a number of country-level controls like GDP, GDP per capita, and remoteness of each of the destination countries. And crucially, we control for wine year fixed effects. So DKT are wine year fixed effects. And once we include the wine year fixed effects, this means that we are isolating for each wine with a given quality the variation in unit values or in prices across markets in each year. So this means that we are only included in our sample the wines that are exported to more than one destination in each year. And if we assume that marginal costs do not vary across destinations, this means that the variation in unit values that we identify from running this regression here will capture directly the variation in markups across destinations. So let me show you a few results. So here we just, so there are fewer results than what we have in the paper. Those are the main results. So what we do is to regress unit values on distance and tariffs. If we do not include the interaction terms with quality, we can see what is the average effect of bilateral distance and tariffs on markups. So what you can see here is that the coefficient on distance is positive, which means that markups tend to increase with bilateral distance. So exporters set higher markups in more distant countries. Instead, markups tend to decrease with tariffs, which means that exporters set lower markups in countries with higher tariffs. Then when we interact distance and tariffs with quality, here what we get is that markups continue to increase with bilateral distance, but the effect is smaller for higher quality exports. Instead, we have that markups decrease with tariffs, but again, the effect is smaller for higher quality exports. So we have that exporters price discriminate across destinations, but they price discriminate less for higher quality exports. So those are the main results. Now I'm going to go to the model to try to understand which type of specifications for the model could explain those empirical results in the data. So for the model, we want to relax the assumption of CES preferences, given that CES predicts that we have constant markups. So to do so, we rely on the general framework of Razova and Neri that we extend by assuming that we have different types of trade costs. So we assume that we have a monopolistically competitive exporter who faces trade costs on exports to each country. And we denote trade costs by T, and we assume that they have the following structure. So trade costs are simply the difference between the CIF and FOB prices, so the import price minus the export price. And trade costs will be equal to tau minus 1 times the FOB price, or the export price, where tau is simply the iceberg cost, or the ad valorem cost that is larger than 1, plus T, where T is simply a per unit cost, so where T is simply positive. So we have that trade costs have two components. This is the ad valorem component, and this is the per unit component. Q is simply the quantity sold by the firm in each destination country, which depends on the import price in each destination country or the CIF price. So based on this definition of trade costs, then we can express the export price or the FOB price as a function of the CIF price and the per unit and the ad valorem trade cost. In terms of the demand function, so we do not specify any functional form for the demand function in each destination country. And then as in Mrazova and Neri, what we do is simply to assume that the inverse demand function in each destination market shows the CIF price as a strictly decreasing function of firm exports. So that's the only thing that we assume in terms of the structure of demand. So the partial derivative of the CIF price with respect to exports is negative. So the firm is going to maximize profits in each destination market, where here we have the profits, and C is simply the marginal cost of the exporting firm. So based on the maximization problem, we derive the first order condition and the second order condition. First order condition simply states that marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is given by this expression here. And the second order condition states that marginal revenue is declining in output, which is given by this expression here, which depends on this rho here that I'm going to define in the next slide. So we have the first order and the second order condition of the profit maximization of the firm. So what Mrazova and Neri show is that we can express the two conditions, so the first order condition and the second order condition, in terms of two parameters that characterize the slope and the curvature of the demand function. So the first parameter is simply the elasticity of demand. So here what matters for us is the elasticity of demand perceived by the exporter, which is defined with respect to the export price or the FOB price. So the elasticity of demand, epsilon FOB, is given by this expression here, that we can also rewrite in terms of CIF quantities. And here we define the elasticity so that it is a positive quantity. The second parameter is the convexity of the demand function, rho, where rho is this parameter that you had on the previous slide, where the convexity is given by this expression here, and the sign of the convexity is determined by the second derivative PQQ. So those are the two parameters that we can use to summarize the first order and the second order conditions. So Mrazova and Neri define what we call the demand manifold as the curve that relates the elasticity of demand to the convexity of demand. So graphically, we can have this, where on the vertical axis, we have the elasticity of demand, and horizontal axis, we have the convexity of demand. So if a monopolistically competitive firm maximizes profits, Mrazova and Neri say that the firm needs to be on a point on its demand curve where the elasticity is larger than 1 and the convexity is less than 2. So the admissible region in this space is going to be given by this kind of rectangle here, where the convexity is less than 2 and the elasticity is larger than 1. So this will be the admissible space. Now this admissible space, we can further split it into two different sub-regions that imply very different comparative statics depending on how the elasticity of demand varies with firm output. And the two sub-regions are separated by the manifold for CES, which is given by this curve here. So the CES locus here, each point on the CES locus will be a different CES demand, because we know that with CES, the elasticity of demand is given by the elasticity of substitution, which is constant. So each point on the CES curve will represent a different CES function. CES demand function. So what we can show is that on the CES locus, the elasticity of demand does not vary with firm output, and this means that all firms have the same markup. Instead, if you have a demand function that lies in the left side of CES, this is the subconvex space, because this would be any type of demand function that is less convex than CES. In this space here, we can show that the elasticity of demand decreases with firm output, and this means that larger firms will tend to have higher markups. And this is consistent with what we tend to observe in empirical analysis. So this space here, the subconvex space, would be consistent with empirical analysis. Instead, in the superconvex space, here all the comparative statics are reversed, because in that space here, the elasticity of demand tends to increase with firm output, which means that larger firms would have lower markups, which is not really consistent with empirical evidence. So what Mazova and Neri say is that a well-behaved demand function should be in the subconvex space, where usually which is consistent with larger firms having larger markups. So from the first order condition, we derive the FOB price or the export price, and we introduce a role for quality that we denote by theta. So the FOB price, the export price, we can show that it is simply a markup mu over the marginal cost, where the markup is simply the elasticity over the elasticity minus 1. Now we introduce a role for quality, and we first assume that a higher quality increases marginal costs. So the marginal cost C here increases with theta. So this captures that if you want to produce higher quality goods, then you need higher quality and therefore more expensive inputs. So the marginal cost increases with quality, but what we also assume is that a higher quality reduces the elasticity of demand, which implies higher markups, which means that this term here, the markup, will also increase with quality. So in other words, what we assume is that a higher quality will increase the export price through two different channels, first by increasing marginal costs, but also by generating higher markups. Okay, so now what we want to do is to try to see how markups vary with distance and tariffs. So for bilateral distance, first we're going to assume that the per unit cost, T, increases with bilateral distance. So we can calculate the total derivatives of the export price and markup with respect to the per unit cost. And this can be interpreted as the total derivatives of the export price and markup with respect to bilateral distance. So we get those two expressions here, first for the price and first for the markup, where those expressions can be either positive or negative or equal to 0. So we know from the data that the markup and the prices tend to increase with bilateral distance. So the two total derivatives here should be positive. For the two total derivatives to be positive, what we need is that the convexity has to be larger than 1. So a demand function with a convexity equal to 1 is actually log concave. So here we can conclude that for any demand function that is more convex than log concave, the price and the markup will increase with bilateral distance. Now we do the same for tariffs, except that here we look at the total derivatives of the price and markup with respect to tau, where tau can be considered as a proxy for tariffs. And we get those two expressions here, where again, those two expressions can be positive, negative, or equal to 0. What we know from the data is that the export price and the markup, they decrease with tariffs, which means that the two expressions here should be negative. So for the two expressions to be negative, we need to have that the expression between the two parentheses here should be positive, which implies that the convexity has to be less than 1 plus 1 over the elasticity. Okay? This means that the demand function has to be less than superconvex for the two total derivatives to be negative and therefore show that prices and markups decrease with tariffs. Just one note here, what we can show is that if we have CES demand, so CES demand predicts constant markups. So when we have no per unit cost in the model, with CES, the elasticity of demand to the FOB and CIF prices are equal, and they're both equal to the elasticity of substitution. Now, the demand manifold for the CES function is given by this expression here, and this implies that if we have no per unit cost, the two expressions here are going to be equal to 0. So the ad valorem cost will have no effect on prices and markups. Instead, once we introduce a per unit cost, this implies that the elasticity of demand with respect to the FOB price becomes lower than the elasticity of demand to the CIF price. And what we get is then that the term between parentheses becomes positive. So what this means is that once we introduce a per unit cost in the model, even with CES, we can get that markups are going to vary with ad valorem trade costs, and they're going to decrease with ad valorem trade costs. So the per unit trade costs, even with CES, they're allowed to get variable markups in this setting. So in terms of the parameter space, so the combination that markups increase with the per unit cost and therefore with distance and decrease with ad valorem costs or tariffs implies that we need demand functions that are characterized by a convexity that is larger than 1 and less than 1 plus 1 over the elasticity. Graphically, this means that the parameter space that we need to predict our empirical results is given by this gray shaded area here. Okay? And this range is empirically relevant because it involves demand functions that are less convex than CES. And remember what I said before, this range is empirically relevant because it implies that larger firms have larger markups. So examples of demand functions that lie in this space where you have the gray shaded area would include, once we have a per unit cost, it would include CES, translog, and additively separable demands, but it will not include quasi-linear demand, because with quasi-linear demand, we do actually predict that markups decrease with the per unit cost and therefore decrease with bilateral distance, which is inconsistent with what we observe in the data. So now what are the mechanisms? The mechanisms are driven by the introduction of per unit trade costs in the model. So here I report again the definition of the elasticity of demand, epsilon FOB, which is given by this expression here, and which is rewritten here in terms of CIF quantities. So what you can see from the definition of the elasticity of demand, if the per unit cost is equal to 0, then the elasticity of demand to the FOB price is equal to the one of the CIF price. Because here, if T is equal to 0, this expression here is simply the elasticity of demand with respect to the CIF price. Without any per unit cost, we can also show that the elasticity of demand does not vary with ad valorem trade costs, which means that markups are not going to change with per unit or ad valorem trade costs. Instead, once we introduce per unit trade costs, this creates a wedge between the two elasticities of demand, such that now the elasticity of demand to the FOB price is going to be smaller than the elasticity of demand to the CIF price, because now we subtract the per unit cost. In addition, the per unit cost induces the elasticity of demand to depend on both types of trade costs. And we can see this by taking the derivative of the elasticity with respect to T over tau, and we get this expression here, which is negative. So just the elasticity over the FOB price. Based on this expression, you can see that for a given tau, the elasticity of demand decreases with T and with distance. So this means that firms will find it profitable to increase their markups in more distant countries. Instead, for a given T, the elasticity of demand increases with tariffs, which means that firms will find it profitable to reduce their markups in countries with higher tariffs. However, we also assume that the elasticity of demand here decreases with quality, okay? And the price is higher for higher quality goods, which means that this expression here, 14, is smaller in magnitude for higher quality exports. So this means that for higher quality exports, markups are going to vary less with the two types of trade costs, simply because this expression here is going to be smaller in magnitude. Okay, so to conclude, what I have discussed in this presentation is to kind of review the recent, very briefly, the recent and growing literature on quality and trade, but I have put more emphasis on the literature on quality and trade flows and on the relationship between quality and trade prices. So when the objective is to relate quality to trade prices, there are several challenges, as I have discussed. The first is, how do we measure quality? And second, how do we identify markup variation and therefore the extent of price discrimination by trading firms? In order to address those challenges, we have collected data for Argentinian firm-level wine exports that we have combined with experts' wine ratings as a measure of quality. So there are two advantages. First, given the level of disaggregation of the data, we can identify the variation in markups, and then we can relate this markup variation to an observable measure of quality. So we use this data to identify how export markups vary in response to different types of shocks. So we used exchange rate shocks, demand shocks. So I haven't talked too much about those papers, but we look at those types of shocks. And what I have discussed in more detail today is how changes in trade costs in the form of bilateral distance and tariffs can affect markups depending on quality levels. So what we conclude is that quality matters from an economic point of view because it leads to an heterogeneity in the way that markups and therefore price discrimination varies in response to different types of shocks. Okay, so I will stop here and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Shall I stop sharing?
That's fine. Thanks a lot, Natalie. You can maybe leave it just for a second before we're going to move to the policy panel. I would just have a follow-up question before moving to the panel. Basically, maybe just already making a kind of a connection between those two with respect to your last 2 points. So first of all, really nice paper, nice small, congratulate on that. My question would be about quality and the shock story somehow. So you showed the impact of some shocks. Can you also say something about the impact of supply chain shocks on markups for high quality products, and maybe for high quality products that are complex in a sense that they are produced via a very complex global value chain? So if we think about all those high-tech IT products which are sourcing components from different parts of the world, and this is basically what we are seeing right now, all the microchip story and so on. So do you have anything to say from your analysis in this what you presented today with respect to the impact of such shocks on markups and prices?
So obviously in the papers that I discussed today, we don't look at global value chains, also because wine is not a good example to look at global value chains, because if you want to produce wine, usually the only intermediate inputs that are imported would be the barrels or the corks, for instance, for the bottle. So wine doesn't depend much on global value chains. Now, otherwise, I think you can apply the findings or the predictions that we get in the different papers just to trade in intermediate inputs. where trade and intermediate inputs, you will have different inputs of different qualities. And in that case, you can simply easily extend the model.
Okay, thanks a lot. So maybe can I now ask all the other participants of the panel to join us? And maybe you're gonna stop sharing your slides so that we can see everybody. Great, thanks a lot. So here they are. We are now moving on with our policy panel, and as I've already mentioned a bit, we want to talk about, at least in the first part of this discussion, about implications of global value chain disruptions. So we are basically somehow in a world that existed until yesterday, maybe, and we want to be interested in discussing a bit about what are the implications of these value chain disruptions, also looking maybe a little bit specific on the European market and also on prices and inflation. And I'm very happy to have a very distinguished panel of discussants today to discuss this topic. I want to now briefly introduce the three other participants that will join Natalie and myself in discussing this topic. So first, one of our panelists is Gabriel Felbermayr. I think in this context, I don't need to say too much about Gabriel. So Gabriel is director of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. He's also a professor of economics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. This is something a lot of people in this panel share in common, some relationship to the Vienna University of Economics and Business. He took over those two positions in October last year. Before that, as you might remember, he was the president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and also professor of economics and economic policy at Kiel University. Before that, he basically did the same in Munich. And I stop here. He's he's working in international trade and trade theory, policy, labor market research, also economic integration, and publishes regularly in our top journals. So Gabriel, thank you very much. I know it's a very busy day today. Thanks for your time and for being with us. Our second discussant is Wolfram Senger-Weiss. He's CEO of Gebrüder, which is a large Austrian transport and logistics company. So a lot of practical experience with respect to supply chain disruptions, I guess. Wolfram Senger-Weiss studied at Vienna University of Economics and Business. Then he took over some management positions, starting at Berndorf company, and then moved to the US to work in a startup company. And then he moved to this Gebrüder company where he's CEO since 2019 in 2003, and took over different positions in the management board before becoming the CEO of the company. Thank you very much, Wolfram, for being with us today. I'm very much looking forward to your insights from the really a very important and relevant industry with respect to global value chains. And last but not least, we have Dr. Manfred Schekulin from the Austrian Federal Ministry for Digital and Economic Affairs as an additional panelist. He's director of the Trade and Competition Policy Analysis and Strategy unit at the ministry. He studied law and economics, not at Vienna University of Economics and Business, but the University of Vienna. But he did an executive management program at WU. So this is what we somehow share in common. We all, most of us are somehow related to Vienna University of Economics and Business. And Manfred Schekulin is working on topics in international trade, cross-border investments. He's the chairperson of the OECD Investment Committee, so he's basically experienced in trade policy since about 25 years, so a lot of policy experience, which he brings to our panel discussion. And Dr. Schekulin, I would like to start with you first and to try to discuss this topic as general as possible. So my question would basically be, as a representative of the Austrian Federal Ministry for Digital and Economic Affairs, I would be very interested in your views on the impact of the global value chain disruptions that we saw over the last, let's say, 3/4 of a year for the Austrian economy. So how would you assess this issue with respect to the impact of global value chain problems for Austria?
Thank you very much, Professor Felbermayr, for the kind introduction. If I can correct you on one point, I have now 30 years in trade policy, which does not mean that I have more experience, but I'm older than it was only a few years ago. But thank you for the kind introduction. Of course, everybody's attention today is focused on the developments in Ukraine. And in all likelihood, these developments will also have and potentially far-reaching consequences for our topic. But for my introductory remarks, and that's what I want to say at the beginning, I will stick to a more general approach to the topic of supply chains. Of course, we may come back to current events during the discussion. And I want to start with the latest edition of the annual report on the status of Austrian foreign economic relations that the FIW issued earlier this week, which provided assuring evidence that Austrian exporters managed the COVID-19 pandemic quite well. For trading goods, we saw a classic V-shaped recovery. Austrian exports collapsed in 2020, but were back to pre-crisis levels within 10 months and are bound for a new all-time record in 2021. For comparison, after the financial crisis, it took almost 30 months for trading goods to recover. For trade in services, we experienced protracted U-shaped crisis and expect to reach pre-crisis levels later this year. This development was mainly driven by the fate of Austrian tourism, which lost two winter seasons and which is now predicted to reach pre-pandemic levels in 2024 at the earliest. Business services and transport did much better and more or less mirrored the development in trade and goods. One intriguing aspect of this development, and that brings us to our topic, is the fact that the growth of goods exports significantly slowed in mid-2021. And this was not due to a lack of demand for Austrian goods, but because Austrian companies were not able to produce and ship more due to increasing supply chain bottlenecks. Without these disruptions, export growth in the second half of 2021 could have been significantly higher. And also interesting, and that's the second aspect of our discussion here today, is the fact that the increasing trade deficit, more than 10 billion euro compared to just 2 billion in 2019 and 4 in 2018, reflects a significant deterioration in Austrian terms of trade. The prices Austria had to pay for its imports rose faster, by 5%, than the prices of Austrian exports, which rose by 2%. Imports, traditionally thought to be inflation dampening, thus suddenly became a source of increased inflation, not only, but also in Austria. This can mainly be tracked down to price increases in raw materials and in particular in oil and gas, but it also reflects significantly increased transport costs. Some shortages of personal protective equipment, face masks and ventilators in the early phases of the pandemic could easily be explained by sudden increases in global demand. After all, even China, the biggest producer of PPE, at first struggled to meet the unforeseen spike in domestic demand and turned to be, although only short-term, importer in the first quarter of 2020. Within the EU, the pressures to secure the functioning of national public health systems led some governments to measures that further disrupted supply chains. New old borders emerged when some large member states, like France and Germany, de facto confiscated personal protective equipment ordered by and destined for other member states. But these initial problems were quickly overcome, and during the course of the pandemic, the internal market and international trade relations proved their worth and turned from being part of the problem to being an indispensable part of the solution. And then, just when we thought that the worst was over, shortages and disturbances didn't end, but rather spread. One reason was, that's again easily understandable, that the pandemic had increased the demand for durable consumer goods, which in turn resulted in shortages in the necessary electronic components. The digital and green transformation also contributed. And in Europe, the effects of Brexit also played a role. Labor shortages in the wake of the pandemic became part of the picture and particularly affected the transport sector, as did the sudden dearth of shipping containers, which were stuck in the wrong part of the world or held up in long queues outside overwhelmed port facilities. Most of us will remember the pictures when the Ever Given got wedged in the Suez Canal in March 21, blocking almost 400 other ships trying to traverse the waterway. The Ever Given was freed within a week, but, and that's again the topic I want to come back in this intervention, the disruptions continued and the cost of shipping continued to rise. And shipping, after all, accounts for 3/5 of global trade in goods by value. And to this day, shipping costs remain extremely high, up to 9-fold above the levels before the start of the crisis. A side effect, and that's where the ministry comes into play of these developments, was that the shortages, be it of personal protective equipment and vaccines or of chips, began being interpreted in terms of geo-economic competition. The power of vaccine suppliers became a reminder of how privileged access to strategically important goods and technologies can be used not only by companies, but also by governments to pursue their short and long-term interests at the expense of others. In the end, the short-term shortages and supply chain glitches turned out to be the result of underlying structural problems. The Brexit aftermath, geopolitical tensions between China and the West, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, all are structural changes, structural challenges that will not easily go away. Neither will the increasing pressures on countries and companies to significantly reduce their carbon footprint in order to achieve the climate goals. However, there are also some positive news. Companies learned fast and began to invest in making their supply chains more resilient through increased stock keeping, diversification of sources of supply, and in some instances, the relocation of productions. Moreover, there is, or should I say there was until today, hope that the widespread supply shortages may be close to their peak, and that the situation could more or less return to normal in the second half of the year or in early 2023. But even before the Ukraine crisis, and that's the point I want to make, there was no reason for complacency. The fact remains that the COVID-19 stress test revealed significant shortcomings of the efficiency maximizing global just-in-time business model that, once thrown out of balance, lacked the capacity to return to its normal mode of functioning. And tackling these deficits will require not just quick fixes, but deep-rooted changes from a just-in-time to a just-in-case model. From a policy perspective, one lesson of the crisis is the need to strengthen the rules-based international trading system, be it the EU internal market or the global trading system with the WTO at its core. It's true that in the wake of the crisis, trade facilitating measures have already increased, which is good news. But many of the restrictions that were introduced in the preceding years are still in place and will not go away without any efforts. Removing them should be one of our priorities and should be a low-hanging fruit. In addition, the structural problems of the WTO have to be addressed, if possible, before the next ministerial meeting that has just yesterday been scheduled for mid-June. Another takeaway, and the one I want to end with, is to refocus our attention on the trade-production interface. Trade, competition, and industrial policies must not be seen as separate from each other, but as mutually reinforcing elements of an integrated, comprehensive economic policy. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has recently dubbed this as, I quote, modern supply-side economics, unquote. Like its traditional version, it focuses on the supply side of economic growth, but not through tax cuts and deregulation, but rather by ensuring fair competition, boosting labor supply, and raising productivity and innovation through investments. In the US, even when coming from a democratic administration, this may sound quite revolutionary. But I find it comes pretty close to an endorsement of the way the EU is approaching structural economic challenges, like, to give but one example, securing supplies of vaccines against COVID-19 through a combination of measures aimed at facilitating their acquisition and distribution through advanced purchase agreement and increasing research and production capacities within the EU. Let me end on this optimistic note that the EU, while by no means perfect, seems well placed to tackle the challenges ahead, even if these challenges just got significantly more challenging today. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for this very broad overview, I would say. Maybe just, Gabriel, I'm coming to you in a second, but maybe just to allow us to discuss things a little bit more in detail, I would be interested in, as you have mentioned, modern supply side policy measures could get more and more important. And here I would be interested if you could name some examples. What do you really, in terms of policy, think what could be those type of modern supply side policies? Do you think about re or nearshoring? Is that something that policy should support, for example?
Yes, thanks for the question. It's true, I just throw this into the ring. To give two short examples, let's take semiconductor chips policies. The starting point is a situation, let's take South Korea, the home of one of the Goliaths of chip making, Samsung, and currently accounting for some 20%, I think, of worldwide semiconductor production. And moreover, South Korea has recently committed to spend a staggering $451 billion on further domestic semiconductor production over the next decade. Under such circumstances, initiatives like the European Chips Act that includes a mixture of measures from providing additional funds for research and production, that's a novelty, to revisiting EU competition and state aid rules in order to facilitate pan-European cooperation, are not a luxury, but indispensable in order to ensure the longer-term viability of Austria's and the EU's industry well beyond the semiconductor sector. And the second example I'd like to give are what are called the important projects of common European interest. IPSES is the European acronym for it. The aim of this initiative is to smooth state aid clearance for big cross-border projects and to facilitate pan-European consortia of companies to strengthen strategically important value chains. Actively fostering such industrial alliances has already in recent years proven to be an effective strategy and yielded some tangible results. On batteries, for example, Europe has over the last years invested 3 times more than China, with 20 megafabs coming up. On hydrogen, another key technology, we now have an impressive pipeline of some 750 projects ready, hopefully, to be operational by 2030. As regards re- and nearshoring, I would assume that companies are the real experts in managing their supply chains. And what we see is that they typically are not entirely abandoning their supply chain policies in the face of the risks they see, but revamping them in order to increase resilience. And for a small country like Austria, reshoring is, except in exceptional circumstances, no real option. The loss in efficiency would be significant and could not be justified, as it would not substantially reduce overall production risks, but rather replace one risk by another. But on the other hand, there is considerable scope for better exploiting the opportunities for cooperation within the EU for the purpose of more sustainable and more resilient regional supply chains. To give one example, the Central European Manufacturing Core in the automotive sector, I think, can serve as a useful model beyond the sector it has been developed in. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Gabriel, you already wanted to reply to this initial statement. I maybe want to package it up with a question also. So I would be interested in your view about this modern type of supply policies. Are you also favorable in seeing that we need to have an integrated approach about trade policy, competition policy, and further policies, climate policy, and so on and so forth? What is your view on this, Gabriel?
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. When I raised my hand, I actually wanted to applaud Manfred Schekulin for his speech. I didn't have a question, but I'm happy to answer the question you asked. I think the convergence of trade policy, competition policy, industrial policy, more large, is to be welcome. I think this is a good development because there are a lot of spillovers and interdependencies and complementarities and so on and so forth. Whether I am happy with all the proposals that are put in place under this umbrella is a different question. So it's true that all of a sudden we produce battery cells in Europe. But don't forget the staggering amount of subsidies that go into this. So we pay a very high price for that. And essentially, we could say we bribe companies coming to Europe and produce there. And for the production of chips, it will be even worse. And if you look at the numbers that are out there, this is gigantic. So we put a lot of money. Now, so I'm not, totally happy, and I have question marks, but I think it's important to really look at the risks and differentiate the risks that we face. And we have political risks. Right? We are just seeing how big they can potentially be. We have risks that are more, let's say, conventional. They're related to the fact that the company, important supplier, could go bust. No, or we have risks on supply chains. All sorts of things happen, and probably maybe they happen more in the future because natural disasters become more likely. Tsunamis and all sorts of things that make maritime shipping more complicated. These risks, I would say, largely can be managed by companies, because no corporation is happy to interrupt its supply, and they do what they can to be able to sell their goods and make profits. It's about the political risks where we need political action. And of course, because chip production, battery production is concentrated at very few places in the world, and those places are at high risk, I think there is a rationale for doing what we are doing and taking these gigantic sums into our hands. And looking at what's going on in Ukraine, I don't want to talk about China, Taiwan, because that would really make us, unhappy this evening. But we should be, looking forward, expecting risks and acting. And therefore, after having said that this is a lot of money and the success is not because we are because the politics is so smart. No, we have the success because we put just gigantic sums of money on the table. But I think, bottom line, it's given the political risk, it's the right thing to be done. It's nothing to do with the pandemic. There's nothing to do with the supply chain risks that we are seeing that are not politically induced, but that are, Wolfram Senger-Weiss can explain much better why they are there. But I think it's the political risks that require action today.
Thank you. I think that's a great keyword for talking to a CEO of a company about those risks. So I would be very interested in learning about your experience over the last year. Let's say, how has your company been doing with all those risks that you see during the pandemic, afterwards, all the issues with supply chains, with increasing transportation costs, or with the problem of misallocated containers and so on and so forth? I guess it had been a very busy time, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you also for this kind introduction and all the lectures I'm getting here. It reminds me a little to my time at the Wirtschaftsuniversität, which is already some time ago. But I mean, if I look back, I think it's very interesting that you mentioned this risk argument, because if I look back, the problem was actually never the logistic chain. The problem was always the supply chain. We could always keep up the logistics chain. Now we can discuss, it got more expensive, probably the lead times were kind of longer, but in all times of this Corona crisis, all borders were open. I mean, really, the politics did a great job. I mean, we forgot already that the problems at the beginning was, Italy and Hungary, the border, and how do we get the workers in and all these things. So I believe everybody in there did a very good job in keeping the transfer of the goods flowing. But a lot of companies had problems in their supply chain because their risk assessment on their suppliers, and there I'm back to what Mr. Felbermayr said, these are the basic risks. You shouldn't just have one supplier for one product. There's always a risk, but we come from good economic times, so people were optimizing themselves and didn't put risk in the equation. So it was, in many times more uncertain to supply from northern Italy than from China. So it is also not a question of nearshoring, farshoring, what it is about, but to have your supply chain under control. Probably I want to give you, even though Mr. Schekulin gave a very detailed update on a lot of issues, I probably want to give you a very quick perspective from my side, how we saw the development. And you put it right. I mean, it is extremely busy for us because the way to do our business became a lot more complicated or more work intense. But if I look back, you know, the dilemma started with asymmetric Corona lockdowns. You know, first there was, you know, China, then there was Europe, then, you know, if we look later into the timeline, we had, you know, specific ports that went into lockdown. We even had the Ever Given situation and so on. So we had a lot of asymmetric shocks over the last months, or now it's almost 2 years. What happened is interesting. I think I was listening, Professor Chen, at your presentation, you know, looking at a very specific example, but I think what happened there might be interesting for academics in the future, because demand went up about 3 to 5%. We can discuss this, and prices went up 5, 7, 900, 1,000%. So how can this happen, you know? And in the end, I think there are two main answers to it. One is that actually you've been talking about quality, or I'd say quality products, that the price for logistics in relation to the value of the product is rather small for many products. So in the end, time and availability is more important than price. So people were kind of willing to pay, I want to say, any price to get their goods in the logistics chain. And two, we have an oligopoly in the shipping line situation. I mean, there were, you know, they even call themselves, I think, cartels. So we only have about 3 or 4 companies left, or group of companies left. And just to give you a number, what they earned in 1 quarter in 2021 was more than they earned in the last 10 years before in total. So they realized they can leverage their pricing power in this very situation, and they used it. So whenever they realized, you know, demand is dropping a little, you know, they stopped running the ship lines. They just, you know, everybody was shouting, but still they stopped the ship somewhere before some harbor and waited, rather taking, you know, supply out of the market to make sure prices don't drop. They moved ships to the Far East Strait to US rather than to Europe, because they got the same price and the turnaround is 1 week shorter. So, you know, less cost, quicker in theory. So, you know, they did all these things to optimize their bottom line. And as there's an oligopolistic situation, they could do this, and they managed in the end. There was a lot of discussion about, you know, do we have enough ships? Do we have enough containers? What is this situation? I believe at any time we have enough ships and enough containers. The problem is the turnaround time is too long because there is too much disruption in the process compared to before. The main problem are the ports and the hinterland transports. So to get the containers from the ports to the industrial sites, and in the end, I'd say it's about 3 to 4 weeks longer in turnaround time per container. So the containers are stuck in this cycle, and we have a maximum number of containers. I mean, they're producing all they can, and we have all ships running. So even if we put more ships in the market at the moment, I mean, they're going to queue before harbors, and we have seen 70 to 100 ships waiting out of harbors. Or to put it in numbers, I think it was 10 to 12% of all worldwide containers were on ships waiting outside a harbor to get access in a harbor to be unloaded. And this has all been unseen. And the problem is, I think it's not going to go away that quickly because the reasoning behind is still there. It's improving a little because, you know, the people start working again, normal hours, but we miss truck drivers, we miss train connections. We don't get the containers away. There was even Mr. President Biden went to Los Angeles harbor telling them, why don't you work a third shift? This is ridiculous, come on. Why does it need a president to tell a harbor to get rid of this? But the syndicates are very strong there, and they're still not doing it. So we still seeing this problem there in unloading the ships actually in the harbors. So this is kind of the actual situation, and I want to probably add in one interesting side topic which just came up very recently, I'd say about a week or two ago. As Mr. Schekulin mentioned before, that this PPE was very important. This is all this personal protection equipment. But first we flew it to China, and then now we're flying it from China to Europe, and all this testing equipment, all these things. So this is a big chunk of the air freight. Well, we haven't been talking about the air freight, but this is also an important part in the logistic chain. And this became a very important part of it, because all these testing equipment, all the masks, they all come from China. And now Europe is talking about, reducing the testing. So the purchasing is reducing a little, the supply drops a little, and there is a little less production in China. I mean, it's Chinese New Year, but also the demand is a little sidewards, I'd say. And the result is that the air freight rates fell by 40% on the China-European trade within the last 10 days. So, we have a volatility in these markets, which is unseen. Usually we talk about a few percentage, but, certain things happen, and the numbers are really in a form we have never seen. These changes are that high that we have never seen that before. So there were some quick inputs from our side. In principle, the logistics industry is doing quite well, and we are at full capacity, which is always good. Prices are high. I mean, the main margin goes to the shipping lines, but also, our numbers are okay. But our people are extremely busy because the reliability, and probably this is the last number I'm going to give you. Usually, we were used to work at a 70 to 80% reliability on the shipping lines. That means you book a container, and 70–80% of it arrives in time, and in time is plus minus a couple of days. And this dropped now to 20 to 25%. So this is what our people are doing. There's a lot of pressure to check where the containers, how can we get them to our customers, from our customers, how can we book them on the ships, and so on. So we make some money, but it's hard earned, I want to say.
So obviously still a lot of tension, especially in the shipment market, especially with the delays in supply of ships. Maybe Natalie, I want to bring you here in as well, because Mr. Senger-Weiss also mentioned you, and also, well, at least if in my point of view, there have been a lot of discussion about this logistics problems in the UK, especially last year. So with half-empty shelves in supermarkets and so on and so forth. And well, people were complaining both Brexit on one hand, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic on the other side. Can you tell us something about the situation right now in the UK in general, and maybe also link it to this topic of what kind of policies we need to go further in order to normalize the world a bit? Let's put it that.
So in the UK, it is true that at some point in supermarkets, shelves tended to be a bit empty, but it was not as bad as expected, let's say. And I think that the official kind of Brexit date has been delayed by a few times. And I think that firms in the UK have also been stockpiling quite a bit in terms of intermediate inputs. And so there has been a lot of stockpiling, because we discussed about this earlier. And so I think that so in terms of the global value chains, there's all this discussion in policy circle about reshoring versus increasing inventories. But from what I've read from the literature, it seems that there's both a trade-off in terms of how efficient they can be. And I think that, of course, when you think about diversifying your different suppliers, it makes perfectly sense. But in the data, it doesn't seem to be very efficient at helping firms when they face supply chain disruptions. But I've seen some evidence that instead inventories seem, I've seen a paper for French firms where they showed that during the COVID pandemic, the firms that were using inventories were better off to buffer in face of the shock as compared to the ones that were kind of diversifying their suppliers in terms of inputs. Now in the UK, yes, I mean, it's so overall, it is true that there were things that were missing, but it was always short term. So you go for a week, you look for something that is not available, and then the following week you find it. So there were some delays. There were things that were missing on a longer term. So for instance, what I noticed was very difficult to get was French mineral water. So this was missing from the shelves for a very long time, or sometimes you would just have 1 or 2 packs, so they would receive them every week, but in a very small quantity. Otherwise, there hasn't been, I mean, in terms of I was expecting worse, but in the end, in terms of finding goods, so I don't know about obviously firms and intermediate inputs, but just in terms of supermarkets, sometimes there were some delays. We can find things, but prices have increased a lot instead. So that's in the UK, and I think that in the UK, the inflationary pressures are a combination not only of the global value chains, but there's also a Brexit effect, that's for sure. So I don't think that policymakers want to admit it, but they think that it's only due to the pandemic, but there is definitely a kind of Brexit effect on inflation as well.
Thank you. Mr. Senger-Weiss, do you want to respond to this statement?
Yes, just 2 topics. I mean, thanks for your very last remark, because I believe Brexit was the reason and COVID was the excuse, because we had no shortage all over Europe or anywhere, no real shortages. So that was very convenient for UK politicians. But I don't want to elaborate on this one. I want to share one thing with you. If we compare the crisis now, the COVID crisis, to 2008 and 2009, there was a totally different reaction from the industry. Because in 2009, everybody stopped producing. So our inventory levels went down to a rock bottom level. And it took very long to get back, to fill up all the inventory, to get back into the products in the supply chain and to get back up and running. So probably it also took so long, if you look at the economic numbers, to come back to pre-crisis level. This time, everybody continued producing. So all our warehouses, all the warehouse space, even today, it's full to a maximum extent. So there's no space available, and this is a totally different reaction of the companies in this crisis. I think this is also due to the fact that companies got money from the state and could use this money to continue their operations and don't really have to make all the finest calculation. And last point, I wanted to make this before already, I forgot about this remark about nearshoring. We have been discussing this recently a lot with some main customers, and they all said, we invested so much money in our supply chain, meaning our production mainly in China, having the people there, have the technology, the knowledge, the supply chain within the country. And this is now running. we're not going to change this. And even if, government gives us money, probably we take it, we do some tests, or we set up something artificially, probably also to please the one or other. But we're not going to change this setup. Probably when there are new products, when we add something, we can, test other markets. We're going to go to Turkey and Hungary and other places. But they all said, because we were a little afraid on, where's global trade going? Because we invest a lot also in these structures. But they all said, relax, we're going to remain, and we can't, physically can't change this on a short term. So probably midterm things are going to change, but short, midterm, or long term things are going to change. Short, midterm, I'd rather don't see this.
Thank you. Gabriel, I think you're a perfect candidate to add something on the discussion, first of all, on Brexit or COVID-19 as being responsible for shortages. And maybe also that, because we already talked a little bit about inflation and prices. So as a scholar working in international economics, what is your view on questions like imported inflation right now? So what would be your stance on, is it a bad idea to have a trade due to the fact that the energy prices went up, for example? So what do you think about that?
So, for decades, we were importing deflation.
Yeah.
And the almost infinite supply of goods from China at low prices really improved purchasing power in Europe year after year after year. Also, gas was cheap for long times, no? And now we see that the prices are higher. 50% of the price increase approximately, in Austria, the Eurozone, is due to an input price inflation. And now, of course, the Economist was happy about low import prices when they were low, and is unhappy about high import prices now, because this is, as Mr. Schekulin also explained, is in terms of trade deterioration. So we are losing prosperity by paying more. And the Austrian current account is an example, shows what's going on. We pay billions and billions of euros more for the same imports, and the same is true for all countries who need to import gas, petrol, raw materials, foodstuff today also, and so on. So now that is something that one can deplore, but on the other hand, the volatility of prices on world markets is not new. Now, what is new that the volatility is very high. So those spikes of a couple of 100%, this is unusual. And one reason why this is so has to do with the unexpectedly fast recovery after the COVID crisis, after the acute phase of the COVID crisis. You remember, maybe we had discussions in May or April 2020 about whether this recession will be a V-shaped recession or it will be a bath tube type recession. And when I was in Kiel, we were arguing for the V. We were saying, see, when nothing's destroyed. It's not a recession caused by a collapse of the financial system, or it's not a big mistake by a central bank. It's not a war, right? It's by public order, we close down certain sectors. We close a port in China. Potentially, we can unlock it again. And the same is true the same was true for industry in Wuhan, or manufacturing in northern Italy, and so on and so forth. And so that led to this V. But I think many didn't believe in the V. Now the V materialized, and then all of a sudden, there was a lot of demand, and the increased demand intersected with supply that was cut. Now, if you have just today looked at OPEC statistics of petroleum extraction, OPEC countries reacted very quickly when the crisis hit, the Corona crisis hit. They cut supply. They cut it quite dramatically, not fast enough, because we had some weeks some days probably only, but at least where prices even were negative. Now, there was so much oil on the market you couldn't even dispose it. No, you couldn't even store it anymore. And so production was cut. And then the V came that no one believed in. And it took time to ramp up production again. And so there's been I think a big part of the story is that many observers were led into believing something that didn't turn out to come. No? And so cuts in supply and then a fast recovery that put stress on supply chains. And then I think something from network theory applies here. If we look at a very fully employed network where all the legs are running at full capacity, misallocation or wrong ordering is very difficult to put into order again. No? So probably what we would need to put the boxes where they're needed, to put the workers, to clean the ports that are in a mess and so on. What we need is reduction in demand. But if you run it 106 or 108%, I guess now, in volume terms of global capacity compared to before the crisis, no, it's very hard to reorder and to reshape such a complicated system. It's under stress, no? And so and that has to do with COVID. So COVID at the end I think is responsible for a lot of the things that we see. When I was a grad student, I worked a little bit with so-called delayed differential equations or echo equations. They're from a mathematical point of view, interesting things. People use them now in studying traffic jams, no, and how traffic jams build up and disappear again, and then all of a sudden they build up 250 kilometers further away. No, so these delays in responses are happening in the logistics system as well, and we've seen that. No, the jam at Long Beach, LA, we have a jam of container ships. Then with a lot of effort, it becomes smaller, and 6 weeks later, it pops up before the border of Ningbo in China. And so these under stress, such systems are difficult to get into order again. And the stress that we have in the system is causally linked to the COVID shock. So that's why I think COVID matters. Now it is used for everything, you know, and I agree fully with what Senger-Weiss that it's and with Natalie that the British politics it took it too easy. Of course, Brexit played an important role. They create their own mess. They created their own mess and their own echo effects across the channel. No, for stupid reasons. There was no need. While we needed to cut down production and output to contain the spread of the virus. No, so this was a rational and sensible decision. While, in my point of view, Brexit is nothing of that sort.
Thank you. I want to pick up this point on imported deflation over a couple of years or decades, and would like to ask Mr. Schekulin about his view about working so many years in designing trade policy measures. So did we all get it wrong because we are now seeing inflation being imported somehow? So what is your view from the ministry in this regard?
No, you didn't get it wrong, and I have to some extent give this point back to you, if I may. The ministry commissioned a few years ago a study about the economic effects of Austrian EU membership, and you were the lead author of this study, and one of the outcomes was that inter alia without EU membership led to inflation being, I think it was 2.4 percentage points lower than it would have been if Austria had stayed outside the EU. So I see no reason why this may not also hold for the future. That was well established in the past. I think to some extent the current high prices of raw materials from a trade policy standpoint are a data that has to be lived with. There may be a need to help those companies and households that are most affected by the price increases. And this is underway in Austria, in other EU member states, in the UK, where I just read articles about it. So I think that makes sense, support of those most affected, but it does not request any trade policy measures. One issue, though, I think we have to bear in mind is when we talk about open strategic autonomy in the EU trade strategy, this also implies, I would assume, it says there, it's one of the elements, diversifying supply chains. I think this is a real issue that policy has to take into account. We have seen over the past decades, and that was not mainly policy driven, I think that was technology driven, an increase in the market share of big multinational enterprises, which now dominate many markets. Normally, we are only concerned if these developments lead to a monopoly, but not to oligopolistic competition, because we assume these oligopolists will be at each other's throat and will fight for market share, and this will ensure low prices or dampen prices. But as Mr. Weiss-Senger has showed, under certain circumstances, this makes, I would say, cooperation by companies in such oligopolistic situation and exploiting the market power they have more likely. So I think there is an issue to look into the competitiveness or competition law aspect here. This is currently being done predominantly when it comes to digital markets, to digital platforms, but I think it also applies in other markets. And now from what I hear from Mr. Weiss-Senger, maybe the shipping market might be one into which it would be worthwhile looking to. And one small point that I'm, yeah, okay. But I want to add is also in reaction to what Mr. Senger-Weiss said, yes, I completely agree that we should not put much hope in reshoring of productions on a major scale. I ran into a 2020 McKinsey survey that was immediately after the crisis hit and all these shortages. And at that time, 93% of the participating companies expressed their intention to make their supply chains, I quote from the study, more flexible, agile, and resilient. And then McKinsey followed up 1 year later. And after 1 year, and I find that interesting, only 15% of them had introduced structural changes to their supply chains, and only a fraction of those were reshoring exercises. But on the other hand, 61% had increased their inventories of critical inputs. So if it comes to increasing the resilience of supply chains to short-term shocks, I think the way to go is to encourage companies to increase their inventories. And I would assume that the latest round of supply chain glitches may have led even more companies to already do that. final remark on this. The Austrian government has now some policies underway to actively encourage such some kind of strategic storage holding by companies, which does not, and that would be my final remark in this regard, help when it comes to structural dependencies. Here diversification is key, not only for companies, but also for countries. The strong dependency of Austria on natural gas imports from Russia, and now I come back to the current situation in which we are, that's no secret, nor is the fact that this makes Austria vulnerable, and already did so before current events. And while the fact that Austria has significant gas storage capacities, which are only full at 18%, but nevertheless, it's the end of the winter season, so that's okay. We do have these capacities, and that's crucial in order to ease short-term tension. It does not change the underlying strategic dependency. In this case, diversification of energy sources is key, and that's why I want to bring that into the discussion. My minister has recently been to the United Arab Emirates and to Oman. With that being in mind, the European Commission is looking or is in talks with Azerbaijan and Qatar on gas supplies. We are with others, Australia and Japan have offered some liquefied natural gas that's far away and no short-term solution. But that is where the attention in this regard has to lie, not on storage building and reshoring. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel, Natalie, a very brief one, because we're actually already out of time, but just, okay, both of you, just a few words, maybe Natalie, go ahead.
Okay, no, I just wanted to make one comment about this issue of imported inflation. So if we look at global value chains and imported inputs, then obviously there should be a distinction between do you import your inputs from inside the EU, where imports are going to be invoiced in euros, versus importing from outside the EU, where there you have obviously to face exchange rate fluctuations. And so there is a lot of recent research that had shown that when you import, so for instance, if the EU imports from outside the EU, what will matter is not the bilateral exchange rate with the exporting country, but it's mostly going to be the exchange rate with the US dollar, because the US dollar is the main vehicle currency that is used in world trade. So in terms of sourcing of inputs, I think that the origin, so which countries you are importing from, but also which currency you are importing in, will also matter for inflation. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
You know, talking with all these experts about inflation, I just want to give it a controversial, probably, view on this topic in high energy prices, which in the end is the inflation we see today. Because, I guess a lot of people don't want to hear it, but I think it is a very good test we are seeing today, because the decarbonization will cost a lot of money, and it will cost a lot more than now these high energy prices actually are showing us. So there will be extremely high efforts from the countries and from the companies to do this change. And just to give you one brief example, for you know, one regular truck today costs about 100,000 euro, and one hydrogen truck costs about 500,000 euro. So this is what we're facing today. I mean, and you must already be happy when you even can buy one. And you know, we just made a study just for 2,000 trucks in Austria that would cost about, I think, 450 million additional costs we have to cover somehow to get 2,000 trucks on the road. So, you know, if we look at all these costs, you know, this high level of energy prices is just a fraction of what we are facing. If we really, and if you know, politicians really take this serious, that they want to get carbon neutral in 20, whatever, 30, 40, something, but we're going to see very, very high costs on the energy side.
Gabriel, do you also want to say something on the inflation costs of decarbonization?
Yeah, so I think this needs to be said that what we're talking about is changes in relative prices, but inflation is about the rise of the aggregate price level, and we shall not leave the ECB unmentioned in our conversation here, because we can at the same time have massive changes in relative prices. So let's say fossil fuels becoming much more expensive, substitutes becoming cheaper, and the price level being constant. Well, that's totally compatible. It would require a probably brutally restrictive monetary policy. It would come up, we would probably have a recession or something like that, but it is conceivable. No, and so I think this is important for the discussion to distinguish these two things, not changes in relative prices and the rise of the price level, where I think even those who like modern monetary theory, or the old and new Keynesians at the end probably agree in the long run, inflation, or the aggregate price level, is a function, at least a function of money supply. No, and so I think monetary policy is important in this entire discussion. Difficult debate, not one we want to have here, but something we shouldn't let unmentioned, since we are economists here at this conference.
As I'm not, I made this comment.
Okay,
no,
I think
it's true. There is an aspect. No, I mean we don't want to keep the price level constant and have massive changes in relative price that would make the process very complicated. So I think it's good to have accommodating monetary policy, and a price level that increases makes it easy to achieve changes in relative prices. So but this discussion is complicated. It's toxic also, no, because there's a lot of unfair ECB bashing around in Austria and in Germany. And there's a link, of course, between decarbonization and inflation, but it's a more complicated one, and the ECB is must be part of this whole picture. So
because I can assure you that these high costs in the supply chain will remain.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we also exploited the academic 15 minutes that are traditional in German-speaking world, that we're able to do longer. But I think we now have to make a point here. I also know Gabriel has follow-up appointments. So I would like to thank all of you for taking part in this panel discussion. So a special thanks to Mr. Senger-Weiss, Dr. Schekulin, Gabriel, and a very, very special thanks, Natalie, for both being part of this panel, as well as for your very interesting keynote lecture. So thanks everybody for being with us. Thanks also to the audience for joining on this day, and for all the participants of the conference. Tomorrow we're gonna continue with the conference at 9 o'clock in the morning Viennese time. So have a nice evening, everybody, and thank you very much for again for being part of this discussion.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye,
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good party in London.